Okay, so have you ever been texting someone, like maybe someone you're hoping to, get to know better and you're like really excited? Like you put your heart into that message and then like days later you get like a one-word reply.
Yeah. So we're diving deep into those kind of situations today, but with a really interesting twist. We're going to unpack this whole idea of crumb relationships. And it's actually a term that we're borrowing from this super insightful Spanish language self-help video. But don't worry, you don't need to like brush up on your high school Spanish or anything for this. We're going to translate all the juicy parts. But the really cool thing about this video is that it's not just about romance. It's actually about understanding these power dynamics in like a ANEY relationship
Absolutely. So subtle imbalances that can even come up with like friendships,
at work.
with family even. Oh, totally. Like that friend who always has to be like the center of attention,
Mhm.
or that coworker who's like always taking credit for your ideas.
Yes.
It's those dynamics where you're just kind of left feeling like, oh,
Yeah, and you're a little depleted afterwards, right?
yeah, depleted.
And what I find so interesting about this video is that it doesn't frame it as like a good guy, bad guy situation. You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
right.
Like
Little,
the person who is doing it to you
yeah.
is like the bad guy. It actually is suggesting that the person on the other end of those like crumbs,
Yeah.
quote unquote, is actually contributing to that dynamic.
Really? Okay, so how does that work?
Yeah, so the video argues that the person who's putting in less effort, and we'll call them the less invested person for now, often becomes idealized by the other person.
Hmm.
And so this idealization, fueled by the hope that things will change,
Mm.
allows the dynamic to continue.
So they're like clinging on to the fantasy of what the relationship could be instead of like the reality of what it actually is.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly. And it goes back to our very human need of connection. Like it is a fundamental need that we all have as humans. And sometimes that need can make us a little bit more vulnerable to these types of dynamics.
Totally. I've definitely been there. You're like, oh, they're just busy, or they didn't mean it like that. You're making excuses.
We've all been there. It's all part of the human experience. But what is interesting is that the video also points out that the less invested person, they're not always oblivious to this dynamic. They might be fully aware of the power imbalance that they are creating.
Oh, wow. Okay, so are they being intentionally manipulative then?
Not necessarily. While some people might be consciously manipulative, in many cases it's actually more about their own insecurities or ego needs. It's not always coming from a malicious place. Sometimes it's just truly lack of self-awareness or an inability to actually meet the other person's needs in a healthy way.
So it's less about them being a villain and more about them maybe not even realizing the impact of their actions.
Exactly. And on the flip side, the video suggests that the person who is more invested, we'll call the seeker,
Hmm.
might actually derive some kind of like satisfaction or validation from the situation, even if it's painful.
Wow, that is deep. It's like on some level they're finding something familiar or even like comforting in that dynamic.
Precisely. And this isn't about placing blame or anything like that. It's just really understanding the complexities of human behavior
Yeah.
and recognizing that we all have a role to play in the dynamics that we find ourselves in.
Okay, wow. My mind is officially blown.
Hmm.
I never even like considered that the seeker would actually find something familiar in that dynamic.
Yeah.
But it makes you think, right, like what does that even say about our own patterns and the relationships that we find ourselves in over and over again?
It's a really good question to ask yourself.
Yeah.
And it actually leads perfectly into what the video suggests we do about it.
Hmm.
So once we recognize these dynamics are happening, the next step is how do we break free from these potentially unhealthy patterns?
Right. So how do we break the cycle?
So the video actually offers two main paths. The first one is what they call the sensible route.
Okay.
Pretty straightforward name. It's basically what it sounds like.
So the sensible route, like logic over heart.
Exactly. Basically recognizing the reality of what is happening, taking back your power,
Okay.
and opting out of the game completely.
Uh,
No more waiting for crumbs. No more clinging on to hope that things will change. Just like a clean break.
I can see how that's the sensible route, but also like sometimes walking away is really hard, especially if you still have feelings for the person.
Yeah.
Or you're in a situation where you can't just cut them out of your life completely.
Absolutely. And that is where the video offers a second path. They call this one matching the energy.
Ooh, matching the energy. That sounds a little bit more tactical.
It is. So think about that seesaw we were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
Matching the energy is not about forcing the seesaw down on your side. It's about subtly shifting your weight so it starts to level out a little bit.
Interesting. So how do you match the energy in a way that like doesn't create a bunch more drama?
Right. So that's where the nuances come in. So it's not about stooping to their level or playing games. It's about really becoming intentional with your own energy. and your reactions.
Okay.
So, for example, the video talks about strategically withholding emotional reactions.
Okay, so instead of sending like that 5-paragraph text message,
Yeah.
pouring your heart out, you maybe just send like a short kind of neutral reply.
Precisely. And again, it's not about being manipulative or playing hard to get. It's just about recognizing that sometimes the less invested person
Mm-hmm.
is actually feeding off of those big reactions. And by becoming a little bit more measured and less reactive, you're essentially taking away their power source.
Oh, that's such a good point. It's like you're disrupting that pattern that they've become accustomed to. So what else does the video suggest?
So another really powerful tactic that they talk about is showcasing a fulfilling life independent of that person.
So not doing it for them to see, but actually doing it for yourself.
Exactly. It's not about making them jealous or anything like that. It's truly just reminding yourself, and honestly them as well, that your own happiness and your own fulfillment doesn't depend on their attention or validation.
Like you're taking back control of your own narrative, which can be really empowering.
Absolutely.
I imagine this takes like a lot of self-discipline, though.
It does. And this is why the video emphasizes that there's no one-size-fits-all. So whether you choose the sensible route or you go with matching the energy, it's about choosing what aligns with your values
Yeah.
and your goals.
It's funny how this whole like crumb relationship thing, it sounds like this really specific thing, but the more we talk about it, the more I realize how universal it actually is.
It's true. Once you
Yep.
start to recognize the patterns, you really start to see them everywhere. And that's actually like a good thing
Yeah.
because awareness is really the first step
Yeah.
to making more conscious choices.
Yeah, totally. It's like this video gave us a secret decoder ring to understand these power dynamics. So if you're listening to this and you're like picturing a very specific relationship in your head right now, maybe it's with a friend, maybe it's with a coworker, or even a family member, ask yourself, where am I on this seesaw? Like, am I the one who's constantly seeking the validation and the attention? Or am I the one who's kind of holding back and maybe even unknowingly creating that imbalance?
That is a really powerful question to ask yourself. And the good news is, if you're finding yourself more often than not on the seeker side of that dynamic, you have the power to change it.
Right.
It starts with that awareness, but it also really requires action.
Right. Like maybe choosing to walk away from a dynamic that's no longer serving you. Or like even getting honest with yourself about the patterns that you're repeating in your life.
Exactly. It's about recognizing your own inherent worth
Mm.
and setting really healthy boundaries. They always say you teach people how to treat you, and it's so true. And by showing up with that self-respect and demanding that same respect from the other people that you're in relationships with, you create that space for much healthier
Yeah.
and much more fulfilling connections to flourish.
That's a really good point. It's not about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about like taking ownership of your own role and recognizing that we always have a choice in how we respond.
Perfectly said. Sometimes the most empowering choice is to walk away from that seesaw altogether.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive into this really fascinating world of crumb relationships. We really hope that this episode has given you the tools and the insights that you need to not only recognize these dynamics when they're happening in your own life, but also navigate them with so much more confidence and self-awareness.
Absolutely. It was such a pleasure diving deep with you today.
Until next time, keep exploring those relationship patterns. And remember, you deserve to be in relationships that feel good, that feel balanced, and that truly nourish your soul.